Well, I'm sure that's given all of us a lot of food for thought, some new insights and also some new perspectives on the course of history as well as specific periods. And now it's our chance to have our panel of experts and scholars here respond to the presentation with any comments or questions that they might have. So I'd like to open it up to them. If anybody has any responses they'd like to offer. Well, I'll start. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to observe that as I understand it, the Barbie doll was created by a Jewish woman in Denver, Colorado. It's typical of anti-Semitism, of course, to focus on a detail. I think it's on. Is it on? Yes. Hello? Bad microphone. Is this better? I was just making the observation that the Barbie doll was created by a Jew, as it happens. But it's exactly that point on which the psychology of anti-Semitism works. That is, what may be a completely marginal biographical fact is focused on as somehow the causative element. That is, that this quintessential shiksa doll is must stem from some kind of Jewish neuroses and attempt to take over the world. But I think that's exactly, to get to, for example, Iraq. One of the things that was very much focused on by Arab critics of the United States is when General J. Garner was, for a very brief time, the viceroy of Iraq until he was yanked out. They played up the fact that he was a supporter of Israel. But to make the story more complicated, the foreword in it, when it wrote an article about the appointment of Jay Garner, said pro-Israel general appointed to run Iraq. So and I think that supports Derek's point that there is a way in which the actual political conflict here can be mobilized in the service of anti-Semitism or anti-Americanism. Just a few random remarks.
I'd like to ask a question. Does this work?
Yes.
Thanks. I'd like to ask a question. Your talk was wonderful. It was rich. It was full of detail, and it was analytical, and it opened up some new insights. I loved the way you talked about anti-Semitism as a symptom rather than a syndrome. I'd want to know if you could put in an outline form or in a few short sentences some kind of organizing print. I'm sorry, I'm trying to talk to my colleague and I'm not talking into the microphone. I want to know whether you could put... Takes a rabbi to figure out how to use a microphone. Thank you. Whether you see particular patterns in the circumstances in which anti-Semitism will or won't arise, sort of what circumstance, it's a sociological question.
Well, the question of, are there certain circumstances under which anti-Semitism will flourish or will recede, right? And the problem is that one cannot rely entirely, and Professor Bauer was quite right about this last night, one cannot rely entirely upon deterministic, materialistic, economically, socioeconomically derived explanations. However, having said that, it seems to me that anti-Semitism does flourish in unstable environments, one kind or another. It's not absolutely going, 100%. There can be economic instability. It can be cultural instability. It can be political, or it can be a combination of all of the above, as, for example, has been the case in the Middle East in the 20th century. It can be certainly a combination of socioeconomic instability, as was the case in late 19th century Europe. So I'm trying to think, have there been cases where there has been a real recrudescence of anti-Semitism in a relatively inflammable political ecology, where things were fairly stable? What you do have, and here I would defer to my colleague, Professor Endelman, In the case of England, it might be interesting to think about a relatively stable society compared to other European ones. There certainly is anti-Semitism, but perhaps of a different form. So maybe England could serve as a kind of a model or a test case. What you would think about this?
Well, the question, one of the things I will be talking about, in fact, is the question of anti-Semitism in England today and Western Europe in general. The problem is more complicated because I don't think you can talk about, well, first of all, the kinds of anti-Semitism we're talking about today, those are things I'll be talking about, are so different from the pre-war period. Is this mic not on?
You have to.
Okay, all right. No, is this better? Wow, that's good. Political instability is not the basis for the current outbreaks of anti-Semitism in Western Europe. But again, as Yehuda Bauer suggested like last night, the term anti-Semitism covers a whole variety of phenomena. And I'm going to be talking specifically about the forms it takes today, which I don't think have very much to do with social and economic difficulties, but are connected to events in part having to do with the Holocaust, not entirely, but in part having to do with that, and other kinds of contemporary ways of political thinking that are not rooted in domestic political conditions. So it is a very different kind of situation. I think that's, and the problem is we are stuck with the term anti-Semitism. We can spell it with a small a and without a hyphen to make it as if we want to say there is no such thing as Semitism. We can try the term Judeophobia. We can use the term Jew bashing, which maybe is a somewhat better term, a little more crude. But we are essentially stuck with the term. And it may be one of those terms that simply there's nothing we can do about. But it's like the term liberal or liberalism, which covers a whole variety of things. And so we have to be very specific about what, and clear about what we mean when we use the term.
Do you want to respond to that? Or?
I just want to pick up that. I agree completely that, I mean, the instability can take many different forms. So, and you can have, look, in the United States, the 1930s, yes, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. Was that the result of economic crisis? Well, there had been anti-Semitism in the 1920s. That was more political crisis. The problem is there's almost always going to be a crisis of one kind or another. It would seem that what we have today, we have a fundamentally unstable world for reasons that go far beyond economic change, although globalization, economic transformation is certainly part of it. So political instability and cultural instability also play a role. But the other question regarding contemporary Europe is one where even when the situation is fairly stable, there's all kinds of repressed tragedy, repressed trauma, which then, since 1989, particularly in Eastern Europe, has bubbled up to the surface. So again, you can have all kinds of psychological or collective psychological ailments that promote anti-Semitism without resorting to, and I think we all agree on this panel, we will not resort to crude socioeconomic determinist explanations for anti-Semitism.
Yeah, a question. There's a lot of talk, some of it I'm sure empty, but about the culture war or wars in this country, in our society at the moment. Would you, do you think that that might be a kind of instability that would encourage, promote, allow what we're calling anti-Semitism?
I can offer my own views, and I'd want to hear from my fellow panelists on this. I mean, my own sense is that the cultural wars in this country, you know, it's cultural wars between, I speak now as an outsider, having taken Canadian citizenship and living just across the border. It's a struggle in which it seems to me Jews play, you know, much less a role. I'm not saying they don't play a role as participants, because they do, but as victims or as objects. What amazes me as an outsider now is how little anti-Semitism plays in the great battle between the forces of neoconservatism and neoliberalism, right? So this strikes me as something far less severe than I would have expected. But after all, you'll be hearing from this, I guess, extensively from David on Sunday, but I don't know if you wanted to respond directly to.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting in the United States today is that you actually have the forces of conservatism in these culture wars who align themselves with Jews. Because in the past, the idea typically was, for example, in Weimar Germany, the Jews are avant-garde. The Jews are promoting a kind of corrosive culture that's destroying traditional German culture. But now we have a phenomenon in which evangelical Christians feel a kind of solidarity with Jews for reasons that I'll talk about on Sunday. And so you have a complete realignment in which Jews are not necessarily seen as or even though Jews are probably overrepresented among those who are seen as promoting the culture of diversity and multiculturalism and so on. Nevertheless, institutionally, Jews are not seen in that fashion. And so this, I think, has weakened anti-Semitism in the United States. It's really pushed out to the margins, and what one finds typically are those voices who criticize American foreign policy in the Middle East, either from the right or the left, and here the right and the left tend to converge, and specifically label American foreign policy the creature of the Jewish or Israel lobby. That's really where I see a crudescence of anti-Semitism now, and it's still quite marginal.
I just want to make a footnote. I'm acquainted intimately with Christian evangelicals in the same way that I'm acquainted with my neighbor's mongrel dog, but I do know them. And what you say is true, but only Jews who embrace what we're calling the Zionist vision here. I think a lot of Jews that I know and types would not at all be embraced by the evangelical Christian right unless they have that laser beam biblical vision of Israel.
Well, this is the advantage to stereotypes. Once in a while, you get credit for something you have nothing to do with. And people see Joe Lieberman as much more of a poster child for American Judaism from that evangelical perspective than Barney Frank, when in fact Barney Frank, the gay congressman from Massachusetts, is probably more typical of American Jews than Joe Lieberman. Yehuda, please.
I'd like to ask...
Sorry, Yehuda first and then.
I just want to make a few comments on a very interesting, very productive paper on the problem of continuity versus discontinuity. This is a dialectical process. To emphasize one against the other is, I think, dangerous. You have to look at both. There is a certain constant in the development of anti-Semitism. After all, why against Jews and not against, as the saying was in Germany, against bicycle riders? One has to understand that there is a certain very deep cultural phenomenon there, not exactly, you were quite right, of course, not as they thought in the 1950s and 60s, a prejudice, not a prejudice, it's a cultural phenomenon. Second comment is that I think it's erroneous to say that the Nazis were not interested in Zionism or didn't have a clear attitude to it. In fact, Hitler himself, until 1938, prevented any kind of stoppage of emigration of German Jews to Palestine, to the extent that he opposed all the German economic interests that wanted to stop the transfer of Jewish funds from Germany to Palestine. That's Hitler personally. The SS proceeded with a very radical program of emigrating Jews to Palestine, although they knew perfectly well that the German Foreign Office opposed Zionism because it threatened to create a new Vatican for the Jews that would control the world from there. So you have a complicated situation there, but certainly important elements in the Nazi empire supported Zionism. Now, the other major point, I think, is the problem of misunderstanding the difference between Arab national opposition to Israel in the Middle East and Muslim, not fundamentalism, Muslim radicalism, fundamentalism. There are plenty of fundamentalist Christians and Jews and Buddhists and so on. Radical Islam is also fundamentalist, but that's not its distinguishing quality. Its distinguishing quality is very new, very new. And it did not arise because of Israel. The founding ideologue of Islamic radicalism was an Egyptian one-time diplomat by the name of Said Qutb, who wrote his stuff in 1950. This is 17 years before the occupation of the West Bank. So nobody's going to tell me that that is motivated by any kind of attitude to Zionism as the main point. Of course, he was against Israel. He wrote in 1950, 2 years after the establishment of the state. But his major points were not that. When he wrote his booklet against the Jews, it was against the Jews. And contemporary radical Islam, as represented, for instance, by, again, an Egyptian, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is the deputy of Osama bin Laden, is clearly indicated their violent opposition to Israel pretty late. In the founding documents of radical Islam, yes, Palestine is mentioned. But the crucial element is the rise of Islam, the conquest of the world by Islam. To look at that purely from a political perspective regarding the Middle East and Israel is wrong. Which doesn't mean to say that Israel is unimportant there. Of course it is. The fight between Israel and the Palestinians certainly does influence the radical Islamic propaganda. But it's not Arab. It's Islamic. Please understand that. Radical Islam is against Arab nationalism. Said Qutb was executed in 1966 by the Nasrid regime because he opposed Arab nationalism. And when Mahathir Mohamad a few days ago declared his famous declaration in Malaysia, he is no Arab. We are facing a much more difficult problem there than when you concentrate on America. You're not going to have an anti-Semitic revolution in America. You're not threatened with any Holocaust in America, or in England, or in France, or in Holland, or in Germany, or in Italy, or in Latin America.
Sure. First, regarding the way the Nazis approached the whole question of Zionism. Well, first of all, regarding the question of continuity and rupture and so on. Of course, it has to be understood dialectically, and in the longer versions of this paper that I'm working on, of course, I go into that in depth. The reason I'm stressing rupture is simply because, and it might be that I'm misreading my audience, but I do so much of this sort of public speaking, and so often I run into an assumption of a kind of a simplistic continuity that I argue for discontinuity. But yes, you're right. The dialectic does explain the situation. But regarding the Nazis, I think it's a little bit more complicated. It's true that one finds a kind of pragmatic support, promotion of Jewish immigration to Palestine, supported by Hitler himself, the SS, Adolf Eichmann in particular, until 1940. It's true. But what I find interesting in reading the sources on this subject is how it was very difficult to justify ideologically in the face of previous Nazi statements. Of course, the answer is that Nazi ideology often didn't matter when it came to dealing on the ground. Once again, we get text and context. But what I was talking about was the way that Zionism fits into the anti-Semitic worldview. Real life always intrudes, right? People have ideological positions which they sacrifice or compromise. But the fact is that there was this period of a few years where the Nazi regime did support Zionism on pragmatic grounds and then stopped as part of the general framework of preparing for genocide, for the destruction of the Jewish people. But I think your main point, certainly the most germane and relevant one for our discussions today, has to do with Islam. And I agree with you completely. If I sounded as if I was saying something different, then I was simply abridging my written remarks, because there is a profound distinction between what I call radical Islam's Manichaean anti-Semitism and what I do believe is a more pragmatically defined, characterized anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment that one finds not just among intellectuals, but also among politicians in the street, in much of the Muslim world and Arab world, with all due respect for the separations between them. That what I would also call a kind of ontological anti-Semitism associated with Sayyid Qutb, in which the Jew is the author of all evil, is not what I would say is, and I think you would agree with me, this is not indicative or representative of the entire, 1.2 billion strong Muslim world. And it's true that radical Islam only turned seriously to an interest in Israel quite late. It really took, as Emmanuel Sivan has written, it took the Iranian Revolution, the Lebanon War, it took a lot of things to get Israel in central position. In fact, this was brought home to me quite clearly at Indiana not long before I left. I had a teaching assistant for my course on the Arab-Israeli conflict, nice young man from Egypt, and the one thing we could agree on is that we didn't like Nasser, because he was an Islamicist. And he gave a lecture, I remember, on the origins of Arab nationalism, which was infinitely more critical than anything I would have done. Because for him, Arab nationalism was nothing but a tool of the West. And that great secularist Arab leaders, Nouri al-Said, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and so on, were essentially no less pawns of the West than, let's say, King Farouk and Faisal had been. That's a very interesting distinction.
Two things. One comment. Is it really possible to speak about anti-Semitism without religion? Without understanding the influence of religion, the basis of religion, the nature of religion as form its kind of anti-Semitism. There are various religions, there are various kinds of anti-Semitism. But Islam, from the beginning, started as a conquering religion. It is not a radical Islam. It's Muhammad's Islam that started as a conquering religion, first against the Arabs, then against the Arabs, then against the Arabs, then against other people. It's an imperialistic religion by nature. The basis of Islam is imperialism of Islam. From this comes the word pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism is not pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism is the supremacy of Arabs, the Arab language, the Arab religion on all nations that can be subjugated to the Arab regimes. Maimonides not only wrote to Yemen, Maimonides was a victim of pogroms in this wonderful golden period of cooperation between Jews and Arabs in Spain. He and his family had to flee first to North Africa, then all over the Mediterranean, then through Israel, then finally to Egypt, where he could find a position because there were many pockets in the Islam world that were tolerant. Shmuel HaNagid's son was killed in a pogrom. Anti-Semitism never stopped in Islam. It is not a new thing, it is not a radical thing, it is part of Islam. And I refer you to Albert Memmi. Of course, for many, many years, the anti-Semitism of Islam wasn't aggressive. For many, many years, the anti-Semitism of Islam had only the form of the feeling of supremacy. And any ideology with supremacy, is it racial, is it communist, is it nationalist, is it religious? The minute you believe that you are supreme to others, the minute you believe that others are inferior to you, like the Jews are inferior in the eyes of the Muslims, so as long as they agreed to be inferior, as long as they agreed not to walk on the sidewalk, as long as they agreed not to hold any positions in government, as long as they agreed to the absolute inequality of Jews in all Islam world, this anti-Semitism was quiet, latent. The minute it changed, it became aggressive. Then it became radical. Radical Islam joined the supremacy trend, which is basic to Islam. And anyhow, we cannot talk about cultural, social, economic, or political causes without talking about the essential cause of religion being a basis of hatred.
Well, there certainly is a religious basis to very powerful and perhaps primal religious basis to anti-Semitism. But I'm uncomfortable, frankly, with characterizations of an entire religious civilization as being, sort of inherent, endemic, and unchanging. I'm thinking, for example, Islam begins as a conquering religion. This is true. Christianity begins, in fact, for well over a millennium or millennium and a half. Christianity is based upon conquest. It's based upon mass bloodshed. It's based upon a very highly limited tolerance essentially of Jews and of very few others. You were better off being a Jew in medieval Europe than being a heretic. If you're a Christian heretic, you're probably going to get burned. If you're a Jew, you're just going to be discriminated against, persecuted in one form or another. There is nothing in medieval Christianity to support a link between Christianity and what we would consider today to be liberal and democratic values. And yet, as a result of a variety of forces within Christian development, Protestant Reformation, 17th century English Protestant Revolution, 18th century Enlightenment, and so forth, the face of Christianity changes in Europe. Now, it doesn't change entirely, but it changes profoundly. I think all religious traditions are plastic. They are all given to transformation. Islam, no less than Christianity. Judaism, by the way, also changes tremendously over time.
Look at this audience.
Right. So I'm just uncomfortable with the characterization, although I don't deny certainly the anti-Jewish elements, which I stated quite clearly, are there in Islam's foundational texts and in many practices. To get back to the example of Maimonides, this is a good example of why victims shouldn't write history. Because if someone makes a statement based on their personal experience, or even the experience of a large community, and generalizes from that particular discrete experience to history as a whole, that's bad history. I'm not denying the persecutions of the Almoravids. I'm not denying what happened in southern Spain and North Africa in the 12th century. I'm simply saying that when you look at the grand expanse of the history of Jews in Dar al-Islam from the 7th century until the 19th century, it is on the whole one in which Jews did not live in daily fear of loss of life. They did not live in as miserable a condition as, for example, it was often taught to me when I was younger, in what was admittedly a kind of propagandistic approach to Jewish education. But what I really do stress is that there are cultural values that are transmitted across time and space, that's to be sure. But when one looks at the tremendous changes in Christendom, right, from Christendom to Christian culture to a kind of secular European, North American culture, the fact is that Islam has undergone tremendous transformations as well. And radical Islam is deeply modern, even in its anti-modernity. So I would, again, place an emphasis on the plasticity of religious traditions.
Yeah, I wanted to just underline a couple of things that Derek said. In fact, the persecution of Maimonides and that community was undertaken by a sectarian form of Islam. And all religions have the ability to produce genocidal sorts of movements or persecutory movements, and we have that in Judaism as well. And all religions have a more tolerant aspect. So the question is, what aspects of the religion get expressed in certain historical contexts? And I think that's the important point. It's not as if the core or the essence of Islam is genocidal towards Jews. And here I would agree with Yuda Bauer. The other thing I wanted to point out is this question of whether the Jews are inferior or superior. And I think in general, the view of Islam has been that Jews are inferior. Now, what characterizes this speech by Prime Minister Mohammed of Malaysia, and it bears reading that whole speech and not just the couple of lines that were taken out and put in the newspaper.
the whole speech actually is a lament about the fact that Muslims have become inferior. And he points to the Jews as an example to Muslims of how you really ought to go about taking control of the world. Now, of course, the anti-Semitic element is that the Jews control the world. But what he's pointing to is that the Jews have invented a whole variety of things like democracy and human rights. As you may know, we invented all of these things. And we sold them to the world, he tells us, in order to lessen persecution, in order for the world to tolerate us. That's very clever of us. So Muslims are inferior to the Jews because the Jews have the ability to do these kind of things. And this is I would say, a great sea change in the way Islam sees the Jews. The Jews are now seen as superior, and that is something very, very different from what you had in the Middle Ages.
Sure, please.
Yeah. First of all, the word symptom and syndrome, whatever. Everything is a symptom. I mean, if anti-Semitism is a symptom of political and economic disturbances, the political and economic disturbances are a symptom of the problems of capitalism, the problems of capitalism are a symptom of the transition of people from an agricultural society. I mean, you can keep doing symptoms. Everything in the end is a symptom. But my main question is making a distinction between origin and development. Things may start for one reason and end up being something else for another. For instance, it may be the case that Christian hostility to Judaism or to Jews started out because of the competition between the two religions. But in the end, by the time you get to the Fourth Lateran Council, that response is turned into the demonization of the Jew. And in fact, the demonization of the Jew becomes a permanent cultural legacy, as Yehuda pointed out, so that even when people cease to be Christian in any significant way, they still pick it up because it now persists. So its development is different from its origin. And the same thing may be true in the Muslim world. It may be the case that the origin of the current anti-Semitism is mainly a function of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But once the Jews are demonized, then you can't turn it off. It becomes part of a cultural legacy that can be picked up. So in the vocabulary now of radical Islam, they don't say Israel. They don't even say Zionists. They now say the Jews. And so its origin, its trigger, its stimulus is that. But its development is something else, and something can linger for centuries, having started out as some kind of innocent, in quotation marks, response to a political development. And I think we have to take what's happening in radical Islam more seriously, because the demonization of the Jew, wherever it came from, could remain even after some resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It could remain as a permanent part of a radical Islam.
May I just add one point, because we are running out of time, I understand. I think one has to make this differentiation, you see. When you talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as triggering Arab opposition to Jews, I think that's quite correct at the present point. But that means, you see, that if some kind of a compromise were to be found between Israelis and Palestinians, there would indeed be a decline in the in violent Arab anti-Semitism. But I do differentiate between that and Islamic, Muslim, radical anti-Semitism. It's not Islam. And here I differ from my friend Yaakov, because Islam, as you pointed out, has various meanings and has different developments. It changes over time. The fact that it started out with scriptures that are pretty radically anti-Jewish, in part at least, doesn't mean to say that there is no change there. because there are vast movements within the Islamic world, for instance, the Sufi movement, which embraces millions of people, who are really pietistic, pacifistic, practically speaking. They have a completely different interpretation of Islam. And yes, you have to consider the religious element, which you barely spoke about, because it's so crucial. This is, you see, Marx was so wrong in that. It's not the superstructure that is determined by the basis, but anyone who knows a bit of Marxism knows that Engels, after Marx's death, changed the ideology and said it's the superstructure that influences the basis. In other words, it's the religion that influences the development or provides the context. I agree with you, context is more important than text. Provides the context for the development of economic and social and political factors that then produce the anti-Semitic development that we are talking about.
It's 10:35, so we're going. You want to respond? Yeah.
I just want to make one brief pragmatic statement, which is we're all very concerned, clearly, everyone on this panel, I assume everyone here, very concerned about radical Islam. I'm worried, though, about characterizations of Islam as a whole that often come from people, most of us well-read, well-informed, but perhaps not as expert in it as we are, let's say, in the history and culture of the Jews. Sometimes I wonder where we get our information from. And sometimes I wonder if the information that we get can only serve to perpetuate fear to the point of paralysis. I'm well aware that there is, in the Arab world and the Muslim world as a whole, there are elements of anti-Jewish feeling that cannot be excised through any compromise, no political solution in the Middle East. Because after all, in radical Islam, which I use the term Manichaean advisedly, as in Nazism, there is no solution, there is no end. It's eternal war, it's eternal conquest, until there's destruction of everything, which is exactly what Nazism stood for. However, the fact is that this represents a minority view, and that political transformation can corral or restrain or restrict the spread of that view. And I think this is the only way possible to move forward, because the alternative, I think, is paralysis. And the ultimate outcome of paralysis is death. So this is why I've developed a framework. Perhaps it is a bit optimistic, but I don't think there's much of an alternative.
Well, I want to thank Derek Penslar for his contributions today, and I want to highlight something very important that you've done today. There are some people who are afraid to talk about Jewish developments and events in Jewish history as in any way related to anti-Semitism, that the connection between the two has to be entirely denied. And it's the difference between saying Jews invented Barbie and the Jews invented Barbie. And we have to have the courage to be able to say Jews invented Barbie, but that does not mean that we accept the contention that the Jews invented Barbie. So I'd like to thank Professor Penslar and our contributors. We'll be resuming at 11:15, which is in about 10 minutes. It's at 10:45. We'll see you back then.